Syndea version 3.3 includes a new interface to TM4J, a test management solution plugin for Jira. In this video, we will demonstrate how to create user-configured mappings for model transforms between TM4J and Rhapsody. Before creating your own mappings, it would be helpful for general background to view the related videos in the Introduction and Jira modules. Remember that a special, no-cost additional Syndea license is needed to create mappings, although any Syndea user can use those mappings once created. We discussed the schema of TM4J in the 17.1 video, but note especially that it contains the types of relationships that may be carried over in the model transform. We will use these later in this video. Custom mappings begin with making sure that Syndea recognizes the artifacts, relationships, and attributes that will be part of both sides of the mapping. Once these are available, the next stage specifies the mapping between them. We started by opening the Mappings tab on the Syndea dashboard. On the top left, we see a list of the tools Syndea supports. Some tools do not support user-configurable mappings yet, but this is available for TM4J in the 3.3 release. If we expand that category, we see that several artifact and/or relationship types are already listed, which come from the Syndea 3.3 tutorial rhp.mappings file distributed with the tutorial models. It has been renamed syndea.mappings to make it the active mappings file. If we click on the artifact TM4J test case, we see that ID, type, and a table of available attributes are read-only, while name and description are editable. Artifacts of type test plan and test cycle are also on the list. If we want to add a TM4J artifact not currently on the list, for example, a custom artifact unique to your installation of TM4J, we right-click the category and select Add Artifact Type, which opens a new window. Starting at the top, we select a TM4J repository from the pull-down menu. Next, we click the Get Jira TM4J Types button. This populates the ATM Types pull-down menu, and we select one to add. Its name and description can be edited below. The next step is to specify which attributes, also called properties, of that artifact we want available for mapping. If we click the Retrieve TM4J Properties button, a list of properties for that artifact appears in the table below. When we create the mappings, we will decide which ones we want to participate in that mapping, but for now we can either click Select All or choose a subset to keep the list more manageable. We need to be careful here because of a limitation of TM4J's API. Not all properties, especially custom properties, may be returned when we click the Retrieve TM4J Properties button. A safer approach is for the user to create a template artifact inside TM4J. This template artifact should possess all the properties the user wants, and these properties must be populated. In other words, they must have assigned values. If the name of that template artifact is written in the template field, before I click Retrieve TM4J Properties, all of these properties appear in the table, a much longer list than we saw earlier for test case. After I select some or all of these properties, I click OK, and the new artifact type appears in the left column. Since we already have an artifact of type TM4J test case, I will right-click the new one and delete it. Duplicate artifact types can create ambiguous mappings that Syndea cannot interpret. If we want our mappings to include relations to be mapped between Rhapsody and TM4J, we must have one or more TM4J relation types. The Syndea 3.3 tutorial RHP.mappings file that comes with the tutorial models already contains the standard relations for TM4J shown in this diagram. Note that the type matches the internal relationship name shown in the meta model, while the name and description are editable and can be more descriptive. To add a new relation, I right-click the category and select Add Relation Type. I must enter the type as it appears in the metamodel diagram, as well as the name and description. The process necessary to add artifact and relation types to the Sysml category is reviewed in the introductory videos. While it is possible to create custom mappings directly to standard Sysml element types, like blocks or requirements, we often prefer to map to those kind of elements with special stereotypes, such as is used in block test case. This ensures that the Sysml element has some tag values that can be mapped to similar attributes in the TM4J test case. It also prevents ambiguity in mappings. For example, where Sysml blocks are mapped to different kinds of artifacts in TM4J, we can use blocks with different stereotypes to prevent ambiguity. The Syndea tutorial.mappings file already contains several common artifact and relation types that can be used for these exercises and as examples for future work. Once the artifacts, relations, and attributes on each side of the connection have been specified, we can use them to create new mappings. We begin with a very simple mapping, a Sysml block with test case stereotype mapped to a TM4J test case. The Sysml block has tag values populated for status and description. On the left side, we right-click the Sysml TM4J mapping group and select Add Mapping. We set source artifact type to block test case and leave the target artifact type as the default TM4J test case. We'll set the structure level to No Children because this mapping is for single elements, and include attributes. Scrolling down to Attribute Definition Mappings, we click Retrieve Available Attribute Definitions to load attribute lists for both source and target artifact types. Click Plus to open the first entry and build the attribute mappings table line by line. When we are done, we click Save Mappings before moving on. To execute this mapping, we go to the Connection Manager tab, expand the Rhapsody model on the left, and the Jira repository with TM4J test cases on the right. We'll select Model Transform in the center and drag the block UAV test case onto a Jira project, Syndea test project. The Select Mapping specification box has a pull-down menu with two options for mapping a block with the additional test case stereotype, a pre-existing mapping and the new one we just created. We select the second and a new test case is created. As usual, we can open this new TM4J element from the Syndea dashboard or from the Sysml model itself and see the test case in our web browser. With some attributes populated from the Sysml model. If we modify and save the TM4J test case, we can compare across the connection and see the mismatch in status values. Syncing target to source updates the Sysml value. Next, we will demonstrate creating a mapping to handle the model transform shown here. A Sysml block representing a test cycle has a part property representing a test case and a dependency relation to a test issue. We want to create a single mapping that will transform test cycle to test cycle, test case to test case, test issue to a JIRA verification issue, Sysml part property relation to an items relation in TM4J, and Sysml dependency to a TM4J issue links relation. We start by defining a new mapping for the block test cycle to TM4J test cycle. We set structure level to children immediate. Because the test case and test issue are children in this context, we will skip mapping attributes at this time, but we will include relations. We build the relation type mappings table with Sysml part property mapping to the TM4J test cycle to test case or items relationship, and the Sysml dependency relation mapping to the TM4J artifact to JIRA issue or issue links relation. Finally, we have to add related mappings. Syndea now knows to map part property to items, but how is it supposed to handle the far end of the relationship? We click the plus button and add an existing Sysml TM4J mapping, which tells Syndea that any blocks with test case stereotype at the end of a relationship are mapped to a TM4J test case. We click the plus button again and add the block verification to verification. Now we click Save Mapping before moving on. Under Sysml JIRA Mappings, we now see this new mapping, and if we trace it back further, under Sysml JIRA Mappings, we see this second related mapping, and if we trace it back further, we see that it maps a block with a JIRA artifact stereotype like UAV test issue to a JIRA artifact of type verification. All of these artifacts and mappings for the related mappings section had already been set up in Syndea, and we used them to build a more complex mapping for our example. We can execute the example by dragging the UAV test cycle block into a JIRA project and selecting the mapping we just created. A new test cycle has been created. When we open it, we see that it also includes a new linked issue, UAV test under traceability, and the UAV test case under test cases. However, this is not a new test case. We had already created this test case connected back to the Sysml UAV test case block in the previous model transform, and Syndea recognized that connection. In our second model transform, it connected the UAV test cycle to the existing UAV test case in TM4J, rather than creating a new test case. Creating custom mappings is not simple, and it may require some trial and error. It requires knowledge of the schema for both sides of the mapping, as well as the mechanics of building it in Syndea. Typically, a more expert user creates the mappings needed by their organization and distributes the resulting Syndea.mappings folder to others. For technical support, post your question on our online help desk at www.intercax.com/help.